All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad, kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, innaka Hamid al-Majid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam. I hope all of you and your families are in a healthy state, and also in a healthy state of Iman as well. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of you from this pandemic that we are in. And want to thank you for joining us. I know everyone is busy, but may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for joining us. This is a very important, discussion that we will inshallah undertake. And really, the intention and the objective is more in line with trying to educate ourselves as to what is happening, why it is happening, and then also, towards the end, inshallah, we'll try to put some call to action, some things that you can do, because ultimately, really, we are responsible for what we do. Can't really worry about that. A lot of the things that others are doing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask you and I about what we do, especially when injustices are happening in the world, when people who are in obviously less fortunate or in a state of weakness, where they may not be able to help themselves. We have a responsibility as believers to be able to help and ease that pain. So really, this affects all of us. This is not just something that is local. It is really, it's a lot bigger than we may think it to be. And inshallah, we have an excellent group of panelists who are going to enlighten us and give us some insight into the situation. So what we'll do, we have, like I said, excellent brothers and sisters. Abdurrahman Wood, he's with us on this panel. Sister Ilhan Dahir, Sister Zubayda is on here, Brother Harun, and Sister Mushtaq. All of them are going to give different perspective and give us a different view of what is happening. So what I will do right now is I will hand it off to Brother Justin Abdurrahman Wood. He is an American revert to Islam. He actually accepted Islam at the age of 17, was inspired by the story of Malcolm X. He is currently vice chair of the Noor Islamic Cultural Center Board of Directors. He is also the Amir of the Columbus chapter of Al-Maghrib Institute. And, many of you in the community know him. He's an active khatib and also an active teacher in Central Ohio. So, Brother Abdurrahman Wood, if you can go ahead and take it from here.
Thank you so much, Brother Nurul. I appreciate the introduction. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I greet you all with the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And I appreciate all of your engagement today and taking some time out to join us for this important discussion. Today, our goal is to open up a dialogue with the understanding that an issue that goes back over 400 years is not an issue that is going to be resolved within a 90-minute presentation. However, our goal is to ensure that, particularly for our Muslim community, and I say this recognizing we have some people from other faith traditions and people who are not Muslims on the call with us as well. But for us, we wanted to take this opportunity to bridge a gap in understanding and to bridge a gap in connection to some of the recent events that we're seeing. And we say this fully cognizant that there are any number of issues around the world that in any given time deserve our attention, deserve our voice, deserve our prayers, deserve our activism and our engagement. And we don't discount any of those things. What we do today, though, is draw attention to an issue that has a unique intersection within our Muslim community for a number of reasons. As we said, the first slaves that were brought to this country, to the colony of Virginia, that took place in the year 1619, so over 400 years ago. And We know the transatlantic slave trade, the horrors and the history beyond it are beyond the scope of this discussion, but suffice it to say that for generation after generation after generation, people who came from the African continent of many religions, and we know that in West Africa, many Muslims were captured and transported in the early days of the slave trade as well. But they were not treated as human beings. They were not given the rights of human beings. They were not given the dignity of human beings. And when we study history in our own schools, we study, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation, and we say, okay, well, slavery ended there. And then generations after that, they had to fight the Jim Crow era, laws that were designed to ensure that Black people specifically were disenfranchised, were not able to cast their vote, were not able to fully participate in democracy, were not able to engage with society in a way that was just and fair. And for those generations, silence was no option. They had to fight, they had to struggle. And that struggle took place in many different ways. It took place in our court system. It took place in terms of protest. It took place in terms of nonviolent disobedience, all of these different forms that took place. But the unfortunate thing is, for many people, they know this narrative, and that we know about the sit-ins and the freedom rides and Martin Luther King and all of these things. But sometimes our study of history would make it appear as if all of those things were accomplished, that the dream has been realized. And the reality is that the legacy of 400 years of systematic taking away the personhood, the human quality of an entire group of people, it has remnants. It has remnants in terms of the education system. It has remnants in terms of our healthcare system. It has remnants in terms of where people live, what opportunities people have. And those remnants come across to us today. What many people will say is, why is it that if I was able to come to this country and I was able to pull myself up by my bootstraps and I was able to be successful, well, why can't Black people do the same thing? Why is it that they don't find that same opportunity? And we're going to explore that through this panel. We're going to explore the reality of what generations of systematic oppression does to a people. But what I want to do is appreciate a couple of things that are relevant to us. One is that the everyday reality of being a brown or Black person in this country, and I've told my story, I won't repeat it here, but many of you know I've had my own experience with my family in the KKK. I've had my own experience with my family and skinheads attacking me and my family. I've had these experiences, and this is in the 1980s, not in the 1960s. This is something that would happen in the 1990s even. And even until now, alhamdulillah, all praise be to God, I try to drive at a slow pace now. I don't try to speed or go past the speed limit. But those times that I've been pulled over, you understand that there's an existential question that you have as a brown or Black person that you don't have as someone who's other than that. You question every stop, what is that interaction going to look like? And for myself growing up, my father had to engage with me in a certain way. He had to tell me how to interact with police, how to behave. There's a code that Black parents pass on to Black children to try to ensure their safety. What we're finding today is that even when people follow that code, it's no guarantee for their safety anymore. Even when people follow that code, we find that they can still be the victims of violence, of state-sponsored violence in some cases. And so why today? Where are we at today? Briefly, what I want to share with you is just an example that I had from, I spent some time as a suicide prevention counselor. And during that time, in my training, one thing that they shared with me was that for a person, if one person, let's say they have a cat and the cat has an accident on the carpet, it's not a huge deal, it's not life-changing. They will go and they'll clean up the mess and they'll move on with their life. But in our training, we learned that if someone just had an argument with their spouse and they just found out they're being laid off at their job, and then they got cut off at the intersection when they were driving home, and when they came home, they had 3 bills that were past due. And all of these circumstances pile up and pile up and pile up, that at some point, even that pet having an accident can be enough to push someone over the edge to potentially harm themselves or take drastic action. Now, in this case, we don't make any analogy between what I just mentioned and actual killing of human beings again and again and again. That at some point you reach a limit, and when you have all these other stressors, economic stressors, health stressors with COVID-19, all of these other stressors combined with a video that shows in explicit detail the callous nature by which someone whom we have hired and we expect in society to protect and to serve us shows that people who look a certain way are not human to him, and takes that person's life. That to see that and to understand that that's one of many, many, many instances, it could be enough to set things over the edge. And we're in a spot now that's historic. We're in a spot that we'll all remember, we'll all tell our children about. That's a given. We won't forget this time. But the question is, how do we respond to this time? How do we respond to this time? What did we do? Were we on the sidelines, or were we active? And the reason I want to bring it home, and then I'll pass it back to Nurgul, to my next panelist, but I just want to appreciate that for some Muslims, we make the mistake of thinking this is someone else's problem, and that this is someone else's oppression that we don't engage in. Someone I really respect sent me a tweet that someone sent from a Muslim country, and it had 2 pictures. It had a picture of George Floyd on the ground with that police officer, and it had a picture side by side with a police officer from that particular majority Muslim country helping a Black person. And it said, basically, all praise be to Allah that we have Islam. And the implication was that those people do that, thank God we don't, right? And what we'll learn today is that it's more nuanced than that. In fact, we have some ills, we have some things we need to clean up in our own house so that we can properly establish justice for ourselves and to be a part of that path of justice for the greater community. So with that, I hope we've just framed the importance of the moment and the seriousness of the moment. I'd like to pass it to Brother Nurgul to continue the discussion. May Allah bless all of you.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Abdurrahman. An excellent introduction, and really a lot of good examples. And really, I think you've set it up. And I did want to mention one thing, as you had mentioned about what we do. And I like one of the saying that is attributed to Jesus, peace be upon him. The saying is, Jesus said, by their fruits shall you know them. By their fruits shall you know them. And that's really, ultimately, because, with this thing that happened, I've seen a lot of posts, in different places and different messages being sent on social media. Well, this is not Islam. And what we have to understand, Islam is perfect. Islam does not have any of these ills. The issue is our application of the deen, and we need to separate that. Islam, obviously we can say these things, but the question is going to be, show me, show me. So really, I appreciate that introduction. So next we have Sister Ilhan Dahir, and she's going to talk about the underlying context of what is happening, and then also go into the police brutality that is happening. So Sister Ilhan, Dahir is a writer and researcher currently working at the International Peace Institute on UN peace operations. Ilhan is from Columbus, Ohio, and was named White House Champion of Change by the Obama administration for her work in her Central Ohio community. She studied political science and English literature at the Ohio State University, writing an award-winning thesis on the transnational threat of radicalization facing immigrant youth. After graduating, her interest in migration and immigrant integration took her to Turkey on the Fulbright Scholarship. She was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship in 2016 for graduate study at the University of Oxford. She received 2 master's degrees in refugees and forced migration studies and global governance and diplomacy at Oxford. MashaAllah. May Allah continue to bless you, and I'll turn it over to you, sister.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and hello to everyone that's tuning in. I want to start by saying that this is an incredibly important conversation, and I would love to echo what the brother said about the nuances of this conversation and the fact that we cannot, in fact, cover everything that needs to be covered in an hour and a half, but it is a worthwhile effort for us to sit together and to begin to have these conversations as a community, because we're on the precipice of something. We're in the middle of an uprising. And I think if anyone were to ask, even at the beginning of this year, if we were going to be able to have conversations as honest and as pressing as these ones with community members that we don't normally engage with in this way, I don't think any of us could have predicted it. So I'd like to begin by saying that conversation, although sometimes it might feel limited, and although we might feel in a moment like this, like we should be acting instead of speaking, that speaking is in fact an incredibly crucial role. And the role that we have to play is in putting verbiage to the atrocities that we're seeing across our nation. And we have to begin telling our stories in ways that honor the people who have fallen to police brutality and to racism in this country, but that also we can begin to envision futures that are much brighter than this one. So my remarks, I think I'm going to break into an analysis of what the problem is that faces us and the problem that's always faced us, an understanding and a discussion of the symptoms that come from those roots, and a bit about the details of the issues that have brought us to this moment. And finally, what are people calling for? What are we calling for? What does it mean to imagine liberation? And what might liberation look like? What might justice look like? So in beginning to address the root problem, it would be incredibly ahistorical for us to begin with the events of this year or even in the events of the past couple of decades. Really, the root of this issue began at the founding of our nation, and that has to do with the logics of white supremacy and capitalism that undergird our issues today. And the logics of white supremacy are not just the symptoms that we're seeing today in police brutality, that we are governed and that we do one another. These hierarchies exist not only within policing, but within education, within healthcare. We cannot forget that we're in the middle of a pandemic, and there isn't anything that really lays bare the amount of injustice and inequity that exists in our communities, like a health crisis that is affecting the Black community in ways that we could have predicted based on what healthcare looks like in this nation. But all of these things are symptoms of that root cause of white supremacy and capitalism, these two things that work together in such a way that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. often spoke about them and the third wing, militarism, as the three evils that are going to impact us, that have impacted us historically and that continue to impact us. So what do those symptoms look like in policing today? And oftentimes we're being inundated with images of brutality, of people dying on the streets in ways that feel unjust, even if we don't have a sociological understanding of why that is. And the reason for this impulse that you feel when you see these images is that they're horrific, but also they illustrate to you something that exists in the logic of policing, which is that some people do not get this extra layer of protection where they can attempt to go outside to jog or even stay in their house, as Brianna was when she was killed, when she was murdered by police. In these instances, we're seeing that policing doesn't work the same for all people and that certain protections aren't afforded to all people. And in recent days, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that these protests aren't the only ones that we're seeing. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were seeing people protesting on state capitals and getting in the face of many officers with demands to go outside during a pandemic. And these people were armed to the teeth. The major difference between those protesters and the protesters that we're seeing on the ground for George Floyd is demographic. And so we have to really begin to take apart what is it about policing that seems to criminalize some communities and protect others. So when we look at protests within this context, we see that people are not just fighting for justice for certain people, although it has become the norm for us to hashtag a certain name. These names are coming at us day after day, week after week, in such a way that we have to begin to see these things as systemic. So the issue of white supremacy then doesn't just show itself as a force in opposition to the Black community, but one that has a relationship with whiteness where it protects certain communities and it acts as an aggressor to others. The images that we're seeing of Black men dying specifically, there's a whole history to be told about these images. Dr. Cornel West recently, and I think very aptly, called what happened to George Floyd a lynching. And in this country, histories of lynching go back centuries, and we see so many of these images back to back in such a way that we have to begin to question, why is it necessary for these images to circulate for us to have conversations of equity? And why is it necessary for these images to circulate in ways that we can finally demand these things that should come to all citizens? And the reason for this, I think, is because without the images there's a dispute of the facts. And that is one place where I'm beginning to have a bit of hope. And that is in the protests that we're seeing today all over this country, in every major metropolis and in much smaller cities as well. What we're seeing is that people aren't having the argument about whether or not George Floyd deserved to die in the way that he did. Even as recently as Ferguson, we were seeing people debate whether or not it was okay for an officer of the law to kill a civilian in the way that George Floyd was killed. But today, that's not the conversation. The conversation has to do with tactics. It has to do with how people are protesting. And I think that is a major improvement. And that feels to me like an opening, a way for us to begin to address what is at the center of this issue. So then what are people calling for? Many people you'll hear use the words police reform, and others use the words abolition or prison abolition. And the reason for this distinction is that there are certain people who believe that incrementalism will win us liberation or a just world or a just country. And there are others who believe that the system that we were discussing, the logics of white supremacy and capitalism that undergird them, policing as it exists, the institutions that support policing as it exists, cannot be reformed into the kind of spaces for justice that we require them to be, and that we need a new imagining. And the reason for this is because sometimes reforms can create situations where mass incarceration becomes even more entrenched, and therefore we have to think about what can actually lead us to the landscapes that we desire, and not just landscapes that are incrementally better than the one that we're currently in. And so when we're doing this, it's an incredibly difficult ask, because what's happening is we're in the middle of progress, but we're also being asked to imagine a new world, a just world, or systems that work for all people and work to benefit all people. So at the same time that we're attempting to fly this plane, we're building it. And that is an incredibly difficult thing, but I think one that the moment calls for, and then one that we can rise to the occasion of. From the 1970s, abolition has been an issue that has been sort of at the forefront for many intellectuals. Prison abolition was a very serious idea after the Attica Rebellion of 1977, where we really began to think of alternatives to the system that we currently have, where a huge percentage a hugely disproportionate percentage of Black Americans are imprisoned, and not at a rate that is consistent with the amount of crimes being committed by this group. And so in the 70s, there was a moment where prison abolition was not just an idea for the ivory tower or for sociologists and political thinkers. It was an idea that was really beginning to grow legs. But then we moved into the 1980s with the dismantling of social services, structural adjustments in the global South, and the rise of global capitalism, coupled with the kind of tough on crime rhetoric that we now know to be a guise for many racist policies. Prison emerged as a kind of institution to address the problems produced by deindustrialization, by lack of jobs, by the closing down of systems that were designed to help emotional and mental individuals and emotional and mental problems. And all of this is discussed by Dr. Angela Davis. But the reason then that we have the kind of systems that we have now, where prisons have grown to be this site that is overwrought and that has taken on too many of our social responsibilities, is historic, but it's also one that cannot be separated from the logics of racism that we've spoken about. So what can we do about that now? The only way for us to move forward, I believe, is to look at all of these issues as intertwined. And so the conversations that we're having now must be holistic. They cannot just be about police brutality. They cannot just be about these extrajudicial killings. They cannot just be about police trainings. They have to be about the logics that allow all of these atrocities to continue to take place, the prison system that is at the end of this type of policing, the school to prison pipeline that targets Black youth in ways that are unconscionable, not only from a justice point of view, but from a welfare point of view. And we have all of these issues for us to discuss and to tackle. But at the end of the day, I believe that the major thing that we have to be holding at the center of these conversations is a desire to see justice played out in a way that is sustainable, so that the country that we leave to our children and the country that we imagine is one in which we do not take for granted that someone's life can be, that the value of somebody's life or the kind of life that one can live can be determined by their race. So we take all of these things into account to have a genuine conversation about that, and to have an awareness that racial issues in this country have never just been social. So we can have friends and community members of all racial backgrounds, but they've never just been social. These issues are political, these issues are institutional, and they are systemic. And the only way that we can begin to work against them, and the only way that we can begin to create communities where all people can live in equity with one another, is to really get to the bottom of the systemic systemic and institutional logics that undergird all of these systems. And the way to do that is by listening to the organizers on the ground, especially the youth organizers, who have a better understanding of what their needs are than people do in universities or in thought circle, or writers in thought circles. We have to take the words of the organizers seriously and begin to build a future that we can be proud of, with an understanding that we have to be studied in our history to not make the mistakes that have been made before us, and to envision a radical new world. And that's all I have. I'll give the floor to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Sister Ilhan. Excellent perspective. A lot of different things to think about. It really gave us some food for thought, and greatly appreciate that. Alhamdulillah, I think you have a great knowledge base and a lot of experience in this area. So inshallah, may Allah bless you and continue for you to be successful, inshallah, in this endeavor. The other thing I want to bring, I just want to say one thing that is really important, and I think it all goes back to, what we should be doing, what we can do. Because, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks of us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's an ayah in the Quran in Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 135, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O believers, be you the standard bearer of justice and witnesses for the sake of Allah. O believers, be you the standard bearers of justice and witnesses for the sake of Allah, even though your justice and your evidence might be harmful to yourself or to your parents or to your relative. It does not matter whether the party concerned is rich or poor. Allah is their greater well-wisher than you. Therefore, do not follow your own desire, lest you should deviate from doing justice. If you distort your evidence or refrain from the truth, know it well that Allah is fully aware of what you do. So, you know, this ayah has a lot in it. Obviously, you know, we can't get into it, but I just want to bring that to our attention, because that's what's expected of us. You know, if we believe that we are believers and we truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then justice it doesn't have any color, it doesn't have any nationality. Justice is absolute when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So next up we have Sister Zubaydah Ghani, and she's going to give us the human element, the emotional element of what is happening. You know, I believe she'll kind of get into, you know, because some of us are really just looking from the outside, you know, and we have to try to imagine, when you look at these things, you have to imagine yourself being in that situation. And that's what empathy is about, you know, because sometimes we don't understand it. You know, these things sometimes seem so far from us, but really, in order to really understand what is happening, you have to put yourself in people's footsteps. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ did. You know, if you look at when he went to the mountain of Hira to kind of meditate and think, what was he thinking about? He was thinking about the social ills. He was thinking about the injustices, the poor that were being taken advantage of, that were being stomped on. So really, you know, we need to, inshallah, you know, put ourselves sometimes in those people's shoes and see how they feel in different situations. So Sister Zubaydah Ghani is a Muslim-born African-American sister and a mother of 4. She has worked in the field of education for 15 years as a teacher, administrator, and liaison for many different school districts in the Columbus area. So Sister Zubaydah, I'll hand it over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. So for me, this is a very difficult conversation to have. The fact that in 2020, we have to discuss and solidify the fact that yes, Black lives do matter. For me, as a mother, as a daughter, as a wife, as a sister, as an aunt, the fact that I have to justify the existence of my family and justify the fact that our lives are important is sickening, to say the very least. Being Muslim my entire life, I have witnessed and understood and heard about very many atrocities that have happened in other countries. And I have experienced many khutbahs and lectures in which dua is made for people suffering from oppression all over the world. Unfortunately, very rarely do we hear of the same duas being made for those people of African American descent, of the oppression that we faced. Even to this day, very rarely do imams and leaders in the Muslim community speak on these issues. Instead, we'll make dua for Muslims that are suffering from oppression in other countries, but rarely do we discuss any oppression that we face here in America. And it's very hard to have this conversation because often in our community, and I've lived in lots of different states, I've lived in lots of different communities. Often in our community, people will give a justification as for why the murder of an African-American person is justified. why it can be understood. It should never be understood why someone is murdered by the hands of the police, by the hands of the government, or by someone who has overtly shown a racist disposition. But yet, it is. It's justified. And the fact now that the discussion is, people are literally waiting for some sort of evidence to be given or made as far as what justified his murder. So when it comes to George Floyd, there's now discussion of, oh, well, he didn't really die as a result of the police officer putting his knee on his neck for over 8 minutes. The fact that now that's going to be possibly justified, it's heartbreaking. Because when I see and I hear of these experiences, it's very scary. It's very scary because that could have easily been my relative. As many times as my brother goes out running, because he's an avid runner and he runs every day. And where we grew up and where my parents currently live is a predominantly white area, and where my brother currently lives is a predominantly white area. So the fact that someone could see him and not think that he should be there and feel like they have the justification to take his life, it's hard. And the fact that I have to explain to my Muslim brothers and sisters why it is that we should be able to exist without fear of going to the gym, running, going to Walmart to buy toy guns because of someone's fear that we don't belong. And this is 2020. It's hard. As an educator, when we see a child that is all of a sudden throwing chairs and they are having a difficult time and they're getting into lots of fights and they are being suspended and expelled and they are constantly in detention, we don't take an aggressive stance with them. We realize that something is not right. And we sit and we talk to them and we counsel them and we try to get them to experience time with the school psychologist or the school counselor. So when we see these images now of rioting and protesting, and the first thing that people start to now say is, well, what about all the looting and the damage to property? We as African Americans are experiencing trauma. It's a trauma that has never healed. It's a trauma that is ongoing. It's continuous. In the last few months, since the beginning, since coronavirus, we have heard of 3 African Americans who were killed, 2 of which were killed at the hands of police. Another was killed by some people in a neighborhood where they felt like he didn't belong. Those are just the 3 that we heard of. What about the countless others that we didn't hear of yet? But yet we try to find ways as a community and as people to justify it. And it's not right. It's not. With my children a few days ago, I had to sit down and explain to them and talk to them over and over again and explain to them that there are certain things that they just cannot do. Even in 2020, at the ages of 10, 8, 9, and 6, that there are certain things that they aren't allowed to do. There are certain ways that they can't be a kid. We can't walk around Walmart and go shopping for toy water guns out of fear that someone may think, oh, that's a real gun, and call the police. Because yes, that has happened before. This has happened. A man was killed not too far from here. And since sorry, I was having some technical difficulties. But the fact that I have to tell them, no, you can't carry it around, you have to put it in a cart. No, you can't do everything that your white friends and non-Black friends can do. Because unfortunately, if you're stopped with them, especially as you're getting older, you're riding your bike, if you're stopped with them, the police are going to treat you differently than they will treat them. And I'm not saying this because of what I see on the news. I'm saying this because I have experienced this myself. My brothers have experienced this themselves. We're just tired. We're tired. We're tired of hearing justifications for murder. We're tired of having to explain why my life is important, why the lives of my children are important. We're tired of constantly being able to support oppression from others, but then having to beg and plead and having to have talks and discussions as far as why we deserve support, especially from our own Muslim brothers and sisters. We're tired. And every time something like this happens, it just reopens the wound that we thought was beginning to close. And this is in 2020. 2020, we're still experiencing this. Things that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents experienced. It's not changing. We don't see change really occurring, and that's why a lot of African Americans, a lot of people are tired. And that's why we have these protests going on. But even with that, as the sister said, we need to acknowledge that this is not something new, that this is something that is multifaceted and multi-layered. This systemic oppression that we experience is not something that occurs just once. We experience it so often in our educational system, in our housing that we are able to get, in our employment, in the healthcare that we are afforded. But yet, we still need to justify our existence. We still have to justify that our lives matter. At what point can we stop having to say, yes, Black lives matter? The topic of this is, yes, Black lives matter. We can't keep up with this. We can't keep doing this. We have to make serious changes. We need, just like as African Americans, we rally behind so many other people and from other countries, we need Muslims around the world to rally and to stand with us. We need you. We need you to support us. We need you to be allies for us. We need, if you see a Black person being stopped by the police, we need you to stand in your car and wait until you know that that child, that that uncle, that that father, that that brother is okay. Not to drive by, not to keep going. When you see these instances of people calling the cops on African Americans because they feel like they don't belong in that space, we need you to use your voice. Not to sit silently, not to walk by, not to drive by. Because that person that you are looking out for, that person that you are helping, that could be my aunt, that could be my uncle, that could be my dad or my brother, that could be my cousin. And if for no other reason, think of someone that you know, someone that you care about that's African American, and just say to yourself, hey, that could be such and such's relative, and stand by, speak out. But sitting idly by and not doing anything is not helping. It's not working. We need to help be a part of making changes in our government. We need to make sure that we are out voting. We need to make sure that our voices are heard, but also as minorities, we need to stick together more so than we do. That's all I have to say. I really do hope, inshallah, that we can begin to see some positive changes in our community. We can begin to see some acceptance of non-African Americans speaking out and being allies. Thank you, brother. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Zubaydah. I mean, that's really, this kind of gets to the heart of the issue. I mean, hearing it from you and all the personal experience, that's what we need to hear, because really that's, in the end, we just need to understand the pain that you and others are going through, because sometimes it's just like I said earlier, it's hard for us because of, you know, where we are and where we sit. Sometimes we don't feel it, but really what you just described and how you described it, really, I hope it really hit our brothers and sisters where it counts, and that's the heart, because ultimately what we want to do is get our brothers and sisters to have some change in heart, inshallah, and then convince themselves to do more, because we can do more, inshallah. You know, there are many community members, Sister Zainab, that are willing to provide the support and do what they can. So inshallah, and we will continue to rally more, So next up, we have Brother Harun Dada. Those of you who don't know, he's my nephew. Inshallah, he will talk about the you know, some of the ills about the, you know, anti-blackness in our community, and give a little different perspective, you know, to how our community views the current situation. Harun Dada is an African American who was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. He is graduating. He's a graduating MBA candidate at the University of Chicago, and will be returning to consultant this fall. In addition to the academic and professional experiences, he has been involved in NICC Youth, MSA, MPAC, and Muslims for Bernie. So with that, Harun, please take over.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sister Zubaydah, for sharing your perspective. And I think I'm just saddened because it takes you having to put your experience up for display for people to fully understand, like, your circumstances, what the Black community is going through, their suffering. And I wish, like, your case and people could just recognize that on their own. I just wanted to say that I'm pleased that we're having this conversation and that you all are willing to be a part of it. I think there's 70 or 80 folks on this, but I'm saddened that it took all of this, everything Ilhan spoke about, Abdurrahman spoke about, Zubaydah spoke about, to get us to be willing to have it. Because the truth is, our Black brothers and sisters, Muslim or not, I think we keep focusing on, like, our Muslim Black brothers and sisters. They've all been suffering for too long, and we as non-Black people must do better by them. And I just want to say, I think there was a comment about kind of tangible next steps. I believe Mushtaq will be talking about moving forward, what are some steps we can all take, but really this conversation is only a first step. It is, I don't want to say the bare minimum, because a lot of us put in some effort to speak about this, but it really is just a start.
I think we lost Harun, so I think there's some technical difficulties. Hopefully he's able to get back on. While Harun is figuring out some of the technical difficulties, I did want to remind ourselves of how things used to be when it comes to this ummah. Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, he was a Khalifa, basically the leader of the Muslim ummah, and he used to actually call many, obviously, all of you have heard of Bilal radiallahu anhu. He used to actually call him Sayyiduna, our master. And that's a common statement that he used to make. He used to say Sayyidina to Bilal radiallahu anhu. And it kind of tells you, that the change of heart that the early ummah had because of Islam, because of the leadership of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that they truly believed that every single person was equal, that every single person was deserved an opportunity, no matter what condition they may have come from, that they were respected, that they were, basically and this is the truth. If you look at the pact that the Prophet ﷺ made with the Ansar and with the Muhajirun when they came into Medina, this pact of brotherhood. I mean, that really was, historic. That something like that had never been done, because everything at that time was about tribalism, was about family. Whereas what the Prophet ﷺ did was break all those barriers and make sure everyone is looked at as equal. And that's really historic. Let me see what's happening with Harun.
I'm here.
You're here? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. My Wi-Fi, I apologize.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so I apologize for all that. So like I was saying, I wanted to talk about privilege, proximity of whiteness, and rejection of blackness. And so privilege, again, is understood to be those advantages enjoyed by a person or body of persons beyond the advantages of other individuals. So having privilege does not mean that you are immune to life's hardships, but it does mean you have some kind of benefit or advantage that one receives in society by just nature of their identity. So it's hard for some of us, many of us, to become comfortable with acknowledging our privilege. And it's especially hard for many of us because, and by us, I mean non-Black Muslims, who I'm assuming most of the attendees who are not Black Muslims are. It's hard for us because we've been victimized in different ways. And we even see ourselves as victims. We often compare ourselves to other groups. It's why so many of us, unfortunately, are prone to saying things like all lives matter, or like just erasing the Black experience because we have our own victim complex. And also we like to conflate, because of this larger idea of an ummah, the experiences of other community members. We want others to know that we too suffer, but it's important that we really do recognize that the Black experience is unique. And so I just wanted to quickly touch on policing, similar to what Ilhan did. Policing, for example, just looks and feels different for many of us than it does for Black people, and it was designed that way. So on a theoretical level, more than most public servants, police have been granted high discretion, and discretion is this freedom to decide be done in a particular situation. It's kind of the freedom you have at work, in essence. So the discretion that police have feeds into why all of our experiences are different with them. It's why so many of us say things like we've had pleasant encounters with the police, they're not all that bad, or why my only worry when I get pulled over is the cost of the ticket that I'll probably be given, as opposed to whether or not my life is in danger. Like when I speak to a police officer, typically because of the way that I speak, I get let go within minutes. I'm never worried about my safety. I'm never worried about my life. I think these are all things that Sister Zubaydah kind of touched on, like how the difference is for a Black individual. I'm really never even looked at in a negative light. I'm protected. And it's why, and I'm going to speak to the Masjid Noor community in this moment, it's why the Hilliard police is so willing to work with Masjid Noor and is so affable when they do so. Because to them, Masjid Noor and the NICC community is filled with these model minorities, and they see the wealth that Masjid Noor has. And this discretion that allows Hilliard police to work so well with Masjid Noor, it's why so many of us feel so safe when we see them, is the same discretion that allows police to wreak havoc Black communities. They have the freedom to behave in whichever way they want, and they've already predetermined how they're going to treat Black individuals. And I say this all to make a point, and it's that anti-Blackness is pervasive in all spaces. It's important that we recognize that we too perpetuate violence against Black people. We hold biases against them, and we uphold racist structures that work against them. I know that doesn't really sound nice to hear, and I feel like, yeah, it doesn't sound nice to hear, but we are part of the problem, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and we have a duty to our Black brothers and sisters to tackle our anti-Blackness head on. We owe our rights to the Black community, from voting to property ownership to so much more. Even in Columbus, Ohio, up until like the mid to late 20th century, Asians, Black people, they were not allowed to own property in even Upper Arlington. And the people that led that fight were the Black community. So again, we owe so much to that community. Our liberation is, and our freedoms are tied inextricably to that community. So before I move forward, I just want to also call out the fact that we are all learning and unlearning. There are parts of this conversation, especially for us non-Black folks, that are really uncomfortable. But as long as you have the willingness to change and learn, you have the capacity to do so. I think so often we feel like learning ends at a certain age, but the truth is we are all capable of doing so. We can change our behaviors, our language, our actions. So I want to talk about two problems briefly that we as non-Black Muslims face. One is proximity to whiteness, and the other is a rejection of Black humanity. For so many reasons, our communities want to be near whiteness. I laugh because it is a ridiculous thing to say, but it is so true. From the way that we look to what we associate with, to the way that we identify. There is a reason why so many of us, me included, identify as white or Caucasian on government documents. I'm not white. It's because our earliest community members, when they came throughout the 20th century, saw the manner in which Black people were treated, as well as some early Asian Americans, and they fought to be categorized as white. Being white or being close to white, they knew offered them protection. They recognized that. And decades later, in a post 9/11 era, we're still grappling with our white Caucasian identities and what that means. But there's a reason from the beginning, our communities from the beginning have fought to be close to whiteness. We fed into this white idea of a model minority. We have a mentality in which anyone can pull themselves by their bootstraps. And this is pervasive in the Masjid Noor community. I am from that community. I know for a fact. We, as refugees and immigrants, as the children of refugees and immigrants, have decided that any make it in this country, but we completely ignore the systematic manner in which the Black community isn't able to thrive. There are barriers in place so that they cannot enter certain spaces or receive and maintain certain types of wealth. And there's so much more to that, but we need to start recognizing the fact that there are barriers in place for that community. And in so many ways, we have stood in the way of their success. And I also think like, I kind of sound like I'm exaggerating or I'm coming from a place of academia in certain regards, but it's even more simple and easier to understand in terms of like this need or a want to be close to whiteness. All you have to look at is the colorism in our, Arab, South Asian, Central Asian, Iranian communities. And if you still don't believe me, literally Google the sales numbers for Fair and Lovely and other whitening creams. It is astronomical how much money it is. We have internalized biases that we need to confront head on, and kind of allows us or enables us to stand in the way of the Black community and their liberation. And briefly, the other issue I want to discuss is our rejection of Blackness. In the same ways that white people have dehumanized Black people, we as non-Black Muslim community members have as well. Like we have perpetuated the same violence. The truth is that many of our communities were complicit in the slave trade, and that many of our communities continue to take part in forms of modern day slavery. So many of us use slurs in our own language. I believe, I don't speak Arabic, that you all still use the term Abid, which means slave, to refer to Black people. And the rest of us that speak different languages are guilty of using other terms. So many of us are wreaking havoc on Black communities by selling the same products we wouldn't want in our own homes. We're contributing to food deserts in Black communities. We don't want our family members to marry Black people. We assume that it's the Black children who are causing issues in the mosque. Let's be real. You misplace your sandals during Ramadan, during Taraweeh, and you literally look at Somali kids and accuse them of having stolen your sandals. you don't want to admit it, but you hold biases against these community members. We assume, and this is what Sister Zubaydah spoke a lot more eloquently and personally about, we assume that Black victims somehow they're suffering, that they ask for it. We silence Black people when they speak out. We use Bilal radiallahu anhu, various hadith, and even figures like Malcolm X as a method of silencing Black people for calling out our anti-Blackness and our racism. We have truly Black community, Muslim and non-Muslim, the entire Black community, and we do not see ourselves in them. We don't even include them in their struggles and our prayers and our khutbahs. We don't see how our liberation is tied to theirs. And even if our liberation wasn't tied to theirs, they are being murdered in plain sight and we still refuse to support them. And even more than refusing to support them, we actively stand in their way. So when Ilhan started speaking, I remembered something that I often think about that she told me years ago. And she asked me, like, what did I want to work on? What did I want to commit to my life to? I've known Ilhan and Mushtaq for decades at this point. And I remember her asking me, like, what would I put my voice on the line for? What would I put my body on the line for? And I think we as a community need to think about why is it that we refuse to put our voice and our bodies on the line for our Black brothers and sisters? And why is it that they always do the same for us or do that for us? Mushtaq is going to give you all action items of how to be better allies, how to support the Black community during this time. So I'm not going to go in depth into that, but I do want to say, again, we as non-Black people must do better by our brothers and sisters. Remember, all of our liberation, all of our freedom, all of our success is tied to theirs, and we must stop making ourselves the Black issues and Black suffering, and we must start holding our own accountable when we recognize the anti-Blackness in our community.
Thank you so much, Harun. Appreciate that. Really, I think you hit the nail on the head on many issues that hit home. And again, I think that's really, it's a difficult conversation, but those are the things you have to kind of internalize. Some of these things you have to start to think, because ultimately, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, change doesn't come unless we're willing to change ourselves. So you really have to ask yourself the question, and if every of us, all of us have some ills, because shaitan is there. I mean, that was his first thing, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked him to prostrate, he said, I'm better. And so we are all guilty in one way or another of sometimes feeling that we are somehow better because of our situation, because of where we come from. So I really appreciate that, you giving us that insight. So next is Sister Mushtaq. I'm going to butcher your last name, Duele, to talk about the call to action, what we're going to do. I apologize. What are some of the things that you can do as a community member, to help out, and it doesn't, the thing is, the thing I tell people, don't worry about how much you can do. It's really your capability, your capacity, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows your capacity, and that's what you need to worry about. So Mushtaq is a Somali American born in the US and raised in Columbus, Ohio. She's an Ohio State alum, a Fulbright scholar. She received an MPH from Emory University last year and is now a research fellow at the CDC in Atlanta. She has also been involved with NICC Youth and served as president for the MSA OSU chapter, the Emory Graduate Muslim Student Council, Emory Black Graduate Student Association, and the Somali Student Association at Ohio State. She has worked with AMPAC and Muslims for Bernie Sanders. So with that, Sister Mushtaq, go ahead and take over.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Norgal, and assalamu alaikum to my fellow panelists and everyone tuning in. Over the last few months, we have experienced a lot of unprecedented moments, but this brutality is not unprecedented. It's, like Ilhan and Sister Zubaydah said, multifaceted, and it is layered. The uprisings that we're witnessing in Atlanta, Chicago, Columbus, Dallas, DC, New York, and so many other cities are a direct consequence of the racism and bigotry and violence and subjugation against Black people that has festered in this country for way too long. All of the speakers tonight have beautifully illustrated the very deep structural issues that we face in this country, and the active unlearning of anti-Blackness that we need to achieve in our communities, in our masajid, in our homes, and in our hearts. So today we are fighting two very deadly diseases, viruses. COVID-19, which is a novel disease, is threatening our health and disproportionately impacting the lives of Black Americans. And white supremacy is threatening our existence again and disproportionately impacting the lives of Black people. And both are killing us every single day. And so this is a time for action. It is not the time to sit back. It's not the time to log off and stay silent. The only moment that you should be quiet is when you are listening and digesting the stories of hurt and suffering that come from your Black brothers and sisters, and when they are telling you what you should be doing to help them. So how do we respond to this time? There are a few major ways that you can act. One is know your history. So continue to educate yourself on what it means to be anti-racist, about anti-Blackness, educate yourself on systemic oppression, privilege, and the role that you and your community play in upholding systems of white supremacy. So what you can do is ask yourself these questions. Have I bought books by Black authors and Black thinkers? Can I borrow books from people that I know? What is my local politician's policy on police brutality and ending it? And how does my community, like my masajid, cooperate and work with police? And can we demand that reform on a local and national level? And I want to note that policing isn't just weaponized against Blackness, it's what others in our community and our Muslim community broadly too are talking about when they talk about phone tapping and surveillance and harassment. Police are not protecting them either. You are also being monitored. So ask yourself, am I demanding reform? Is my outrage against racism being fueled only because I'm viewing violent acts of racism against others? What are you doing? What are you doing? Like, what are you doing? You know? So that's one. The second thing is calling in. So call your family, your friends, and your community leaders in dialogue around anti-Blackness and violence against the Black community. The reason why I say call in is because we often find a way to call out individuals that are marginalized and tone police them and dictate the ways in which they can respond to their own oppression. So, oftentimes the feelings and the comfort of the offender are centered and prioritized, while the person, the Black person or the Black community that is being harmed is further marginalized by having to respond in the confines of the perpetrator's comfort and terms rather than their own. So ask yourself, am I centering myself in this narrative? Have I identified my privilege and condemned it? Am I doing this as a performative show of activism to feel validated or applauded by my followers on social media, or to prove to somebody that I'm not racist? So that's two. So first, know your history. Second, call in. The third thing you can do is listen. Do not labor. Active listening is required. Listen to the resources that are being provided to you by Black women and Black community and Black leaders and Black activists and podcasters and authors and everyone who's like experiencing this firsthand. Do not put that labor, but please do not put the labor on Black people to educate you. There are a vast number of resources that are readily available online. There are tools that are there for you that are being shared. So take advantage of them and read them and honestly try to digest that information. And you can ask yourself these questions. Have I listened to the voices of Black activists? Have I spoken to my friends and family about what they can do, even if it makes me feel uncomfortable? Get used to feeling uncomfortable and be prepared to do the work. The next thing is stay updated and donate. And this is huge. You need to support platforms and initiatives that support Black people. If you're online, using social media platforms, follow those hashtags to stay updated. Oftentimes the information that's coming from from people on the streets isn't necessarily what you're seeing on the news. So make sure that you are getting your information firsthand from Black activists, people whose voices are obviously often marginalized and put down. So I recommend using things like Twitter and Instagram to kind of get that kind of information on what it's like on the ground. So follow those hashtags like Black Lives Matter, for example, to get more information, and then boost those voices of Black individuals and activists. And donate to legal organizations and NGOs that are working to fight injustices, that are racial injustices. Donate to bail bonds to help those that are being arrested for protesting. I know that Columbus Freedom Fund is desperately in need of money, so support that bail bond. There are bail bonds that need your support all over the country, and you can access those links, and I'm about to drop a link for you. There's a link called bailfunds.github.io, and that has a whole list of all of the bail funds across the country that you can access. There are also organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is a legal organization that is fighting injustice, and the ACLU, which provides legal assistance wherever civil liberties are at risk. There's Fair Fight. The list goes on. There are so many organizations that are out there doing good work, elevating the voices of Black people, assisting those that are arrested protesting police brutality. So ask yourself, if you're donating, what have I donated to the Black-owned and led organizations? And yeah, I think if you are doing these 5 things, that's a great start. So know your history, call in your family and friends, and have dialogue about anti-Blackness and violence against the Black community. Listen, do not labor. Stay updated and donate, and demand reform. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Jazakallah khair, Sister Mushtaq, for those excellent recommendation. I mean, all 5 of them really, we need to do. We need to start somewhere, and this is a good start. And obviously, the important thing, and I think this is this initial start, is really to educate. And I appreciate all of the panelists for giving this time, because ultimately, you need to know what is happening in order for you to do anything. And I just want to mention, one of the qualities, or one of the things about intelligence, Ibn al-Qayyim said that intelligence means 2 things. First, it means knowledge of the religion, and second, it is knowledge of the people. And what that means is knowing where you are, knowing your community, knowing their situation. Obviously, as Sister Mushtaq has mentioned, how do you support them? Financial support, or maybe just calling them, just talking to your family about these things. So these are all really, really important things. And what I'm going to do before I hand it back to Brother Abdurrahman Wood for we'll have some Q&A. I think we have a couple minutes for Q&A, and then he'll close with a dua. But I did want to, mention one thing. I ran into these lyrics from a song written in 1949, and it is about the continuous teaching of hate. And obviously, we can't get into the historical context at that time, but there was a lot going on. So this is but it kind of, stuck with me in that, as Sister Zubaydah mentioned, you'll see these lyrics are from 1949, and right now we're in 2020. But nothing has changed. We just launched another aircraft or spaceship, to send man into space, and yet, we'll see where we are. So the lyrics go like this: you've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be taught. You've got to be carefully taught. So really those, that was 1949, but I don't think anything has really changed from what we have today. So with that, Brother Irfan, I don't know if do we have any questions?
We do have one question from H. Daskar. It's basically asking, what is the best way to address uh, for community, for support for the Black community in the masjid? So whether the board or the president can either talk about it or the details for that, such a setting.
Okay, well, Jazakallah khair. I'll, since Brother Abdurrahman Wood, he is the vice chairman of the NICC board, I'll let him address that.
Bismillah. Thank you so much for the question. It's much appreciated. So in terms of the support for the Black community in the masjid, I think what you'll find is this panel is really just a genesis for that idea, right? And I think that what we need to do is we need to understand that for too long, we have looked, I say we collectively as, and I'm just speaking to the Noor community, but too often we look at the indigenous African-American or Black Muslims in this city as separate from our community, give or take a few brothers that attend Noor. And I think that's the issue. You know, we've struggled with this for a long time. And there are a large number of people who were born Muslim in the city, whose parents are Muslim and who are of African-American descent. There's a masjid on Oak Street that has a community that goes back many generations. And usually when I mention the Muslim Community Center to, which is the name of that masjid, to other people, they have no idea it even exists, right? Let alone that there were Muslims here before they or their parents came. And when I mention that, you know, we talk about the history of Islam in Columbus even, we often will talk about, you know, Broad Street, which mashallah has a beautiful history. We talk about Masjid Omar, has a beautiful history. But it's understanding that there was a parallel Muslim experience that already existed in this city and in this country. And the first thing we have to do is raise awareness in terms of how we actually generate support. Then this is the forum where I think that we start that conversation. I myself, you know, absolutely take responsibility as a board member to make sure that for the community that we serve, that we are providing support in the best way possible. And at a minimum, as Sister Zubaydah eloquently said, that we're supportive in our dua, we're supportive in our teaching, we're supportive in our awareness. That's the bare minimum. And Allah knows we need to do more. Allah knows we need to do more. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive our shortcomings in that regard. And I hope that if any good were to come out of the tragedies that have happened recently, it's that we have a heightened and a more improved consciousness. And that, to be honest, it even bothers me a bit when I understand the term ally, right? I understand, I get the concept. But alliance, it almost implies two separate groups coming together for a certain cause. And we are Black Muslims are us in this community. We're not separate. We're not a separate entities. We shouldn't be separate entities. And Black people in general, you know, you find that the most receptive people to this message in this country has historically always been Black people. The most receptive people to Islam has always been Black people. That's just a verified fact. You look at the people who come to Islam in this country, the vast majority come from our Black brothers and sisters. But yet what you'll find, and just to go back to some of the points that were made earlier, when I was overseas, I was with the contingent of imams, and we were all except for one were Black. There was one white imam who was with us. And one of the people there asked us, you know, where are the American Muslims? And I said, no, brother, we're all Americans. Like, no, yani Ameriki, you know, like the American Americans. And he meant, where are the white Muslims at? Like, that's what he meant. Like, for him to, you know, to be American was to be white. Like, he didn't see us as being part of that same tapestry. So not to ramble about the question, but the thing is, a lot of these things need to be actively unlearned, actively challenged within our community. And I think that as we take those steps, we're going to find that naturally and organically that support's going to come out, but we have to make that effort. And I commit as part of the leadership of the board to do my part in that regard.
Jazakallah, Brother Abdurrahman. There are three more questions, so I'll kind of stitch two of them together. One question is from Anonymous. Is it a good idea to go and protest for the Black Lives Movement? And the second part can be, how can Black Muslims already educated on the history contribute more to this movement in ways other than just protesting?
I'd be happy to speak on that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Ilham.
So I think in this current moment, we look outside and it seems like there's an uprising, there's a shift in the air. And so if we are physically able, protesting is an incredible show of solidarity. But for many people, the most pertinent thing I've heard about any sort of organizing is this, and that is every single person has a gift to bring to the movement. So if you are someone who is an incredibly talented writer, or if you are somebody who has been gifted with community organizing in personal spaces and in social organizing, if you are willing to bring your gift of solidarity through a chat, that you bring information, you distribute information through, anything that you can bring to the movement is going to contribute greatly. So find what that is for you and really hone in on it. And secondly, I think the most important thing that we can do besides putting our bodies and voices towards the movement is putting our funds there. And unfortunately, I spoke about the evils of capitalism, but there are so many ways to make a difference with your dollar at this point in time. There are young organizers in Minneapolis, Seattle, and Chicago that are organizing around materials for the protesters. So finding those pages, especially for the cities that you're in, and finding ways to materially support the things that they need. So gas masks and so forth. And then also looking into the organizing happening in your city around bail bonds, bail funds, and finding ways to contribute in that way so that protesters that are taken in for the night or for a few days don't have to worry about the funds that they would need to get out. And the third thing that I would say is speak to the people that are organizing in your city, or find ways to communicate with the organizations that are doing most of the organizing around this issue, and ask them directly what they need. So if they don't need protesters, especially if you are immunocompromised or don't want to be on the streets at this time, or if the funds or if you've given as much as you can, in all of the ways that you can contribute financially, ask them what else they might need. There might be something that you can contribute in that way.
Can I quickly add? I think when we talk about the protests that are currently going on, we focus on the violence. And I just want to call out the fact that most of the violence, I will say all of the violence is targeted at Black individuals who are protesting, most of whom are doing so peacefully. And so for those of us who are non-Black, it would be, if you are able, to stand alongside them in solidarity. And even if you don't want to be in the thick of it, I have a lot of friends, for example, who are serving as like legal observers, they're lawyers, because they're just trying to hold the police accountable to make sure that they aren't committing violent acts against peaceful protesters. So I just want to call out the fact that this is a moment, if you are able and willing, to kind of make sure that your Black brothers and sisters are protected as they protest peacefully and, march for change.
Jazakallah, panelists. One last question from Natalie.
Can I just answer to that question as well? So if you are not able to, or you are not comfortable with protesting, what I would suggest that you do is go out and vote. And when you vote, look at who you're voting for and if they have an agenda or a record that is either helpful or harmful towards Black people. Because the protesting will end. It won't last forever. Blackout Tuesday will be over in a few hours. But the efforts that you make in electing politicians and government officials, the efforts that you make in understanding and knowing if there will be a community review board to help make sure that the police are being held accountable for what they're doing, that is what will have a long-term effect. So finding out what your local politicians and what politicians' stances are on African Americans and how they typically vote on issues that are related or that impact African Americans, that is another way that you could help.
Jazakallah, Sister Zubaydah. A couple of questions more. I just did a time check. It's 4 more minutes. So one question from Natalie Webster is, can you explain the definition and examples of model minority and how it can be negative to the Black community? And the second question to the panelists from Anonymous is, can Masjid Noor commit to a Jummah khutbah addressing this issue?
So I think I was the person that probably mentioned model minority. Is its own topic that we could spend hours discussing, but just really briefly, during the 60s, I want to say the term was probably first used during the 60s, especially during the civil rights movement. It was a term that was used to describe typically Asian American immigrants. And it really focused on these immigrants who typically were already educated, were on the path to higher education, moved into places of power, and by power I mean in corporations, in research. They hit a certain income threshold, and in essence, that term was popularized, and kind of the idea of this model minority, this community that could come from nothing and raise themselves up and achieve financial, educational success. Like, it was used in essence to kind of hinder the civil rights movement, and try to get people, white Americans, to feel more comfortable with kind of like our current system, to say, look, people can succeed, but also to kind of sow divisions between different marginalized groups, so specifically Asians versus like Latinos and Black individuals. It is its own thing. If you type in model minority, I think the amount of academic research that'll come up is exhausting. My email, I'm just gonna say really quickly, is hqdata@gmail.com. I can also look through and try to find some good academic research if you want me to do that and send that to you.
Jazakallah, so Brother Harun. So the second part of the question from another anonymous attendee is, and open to all panelists, is, can Masjid Noor commit to a Jummah khutbah addressing this issue?
I'll answer, inshallah ta'ala. I think we're definitely open to it. Our imam is the one who manages the Jummah, and he's one that really loves to hear from community members regarding ideas and things like that. I can certainly engage him with that discussion, but I highly recommend. He's, mashallah, just very open to learning about these issues and other issues. But I advise you, reach out to him as well, and let him know it's something you want to hear about and that you're interested in. And I will also commit to doing so.
Brother Irfan, is that all we have for questions?
Yes, that's all we have for questions.
Okay. Well, with that, I do want to thank all of the panelists, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all of you for the effort and the time you put in, and also may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward those who have joined us. And inshallah, Brother Abdurrahman Wood, if you want to close with a closing dua, inshallah.
Yes, of course. And this is something just I want to briefly summarize, and for my Muslim brothers and sisters to take this away, just to give you a different dimension of something you may already say on a regular basis. In Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ is reported from Thawban to have said, after every prayer, after his five daily prayers, when he was done praying, he would seek forgiveness 3 times, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah, astaghfirullah. And then he'd make a very special dua. He would say, Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam tabarakta ya dhal jalali wal ikram. And why this dua resonates for me in this moment is when I watch the protests, often I'll find myself making dua, Allahumma sallim sallim. Oh Allah, give them peace, give them peace. Oh Allah, protect them, give them peace. Don't let them be harmed. The meaning of this prayer we say after our salah is Allahumma anta salam. Oh Allah, you are the ultimate source of peace and security. وَمِنْكَ السَّلَامُ, and from you is ultimate peace and security. Tabarakta, how blessed are you? Ya dhal jalali, O the one who is the owner of all majesty, wal ikram, and the one who is the owner of all honor and generosity. And what I found very beautiful about this dua is when you look at the subtleties of it, we tie together peace and honor. That the one who grants peace is the one who is also the owner of honor and dignity, ikram. And likewise, I just have to reflect upon this for our situation, that to truly have peace, you have to have honor and dignity. To truly have salam in your life, you truly have to be honored and dignified. And yes, we ask Allah first for honor and dignity, but we demand honor and dignity from those who would hold it from us. Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam. Tabarakta ya dhal jalali wal ikram. Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you all so much for attending. We love you all for the sake of Allah. We hope that this is, and we intend that this is not the last note that we will have on this important topic, that we'll be back in other ways, inshallah ta'ala. So please stay tuned. May Allah bless you all. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah to all the panelists and all the attendees. Inshallah, this video, which is streamed live on YouTube, will be available on our Facebook and our YouTube page. And if you have any additional question pertaining to this, please reach out to outreach@noorohio.org. And Jazakallahu khairan.